And 5, 6, 7, 8. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Smart and Public podcast. Now, this is a podcast that discusses business, careers, and life through the eyes of public relations and communications experts. I'm Katie Boyson.
And I'm Katie Duffy.
And today we have a guest on the show. I'm so excited to introduce him. His name is Matt Fairhurst. He's the co-founder and CEO of Skedulo. Now, disclaimer, he's one of my clients. I work with Matt. I've been working with him for probably over a year now. Where is the time gone? Who knows? But I think he's going to be a great addition to this conversation. It's going to be about founder's perspective of communications. And when we first started to kind of figure out what we wanted to lean into, we were thinking about media, we were thinking about external comms, and really what the value and what I think is so interesting about Matt's perspective is the internal comms element, and really, what a founder's perspective is on that and why it's so critical. So we're going to have an internal kind of employee comms focus today on the podcast. And Matt, thank you so much for coming on. We're so happy to have you on.
You're welcome. Thanks. Great to be here.
Now, how about we just start from the very top? Can you tell us a little bit about Skedulo and kind of your path to founding the company?
Yeah, we started Skedulo maybe 10 years ago. I hate saying that. I hate the fact that it's got double digits in the life span of the company, but it was 10 years ago that we started. I hadn't worked in tech very long. In terms of any kind of real career, I'd worked at a company for maybe 2 years prior to that. It was a Salesforce consulting company. I went into that as a marketer and designer, ended up in product management with who ultimately someone who became my co-founder here at Skedulo, James. As that journey sort of came to an end, James and I continued on with the product that we'd started building there with the support of that company's founder and some investment, and did that for about 18 months before ultimately pivoting and starting Skedulo. That period was super formative for James and I, though. Not only did it help us sort of cut our teeth in a reasonably safe environment, although, it was a near-death experience almost every day. The stakes were a lot lower. It was this remarkable time where mobility was, even though the iPhone had been around for 7 or 8 years, it was finally starting to be truly democratized in companies, and everybody had one. The companies that we were talking to at the time weren't particularly interested in buying the product that we'd built, but they all wanted to talk about the fact that in many cases, the majority of their workforce was what we call deskless, people that don't work in an office, don't sit behind a desk. They were scratching their heads saying, hey, we've got these amazing platforms for CRM and marketing automation and HR and finance and almost every operational pillar in our company. We're on this cloud journey and we're utilizing these great flexible platforms, but still scheduling, organizing, and ultimately doing work in the field with these people that don't sit in an office on paper and on whiteboards and using calendars and things, and there just has to be a better way. And I fell in love with that problem as a designer, and that was really the spark that encouraged us to pivot entirely and start building Skedulo.
It's crazy to think how many businesses probably were founded off the back of the iPhone, and then also thinking about how things got catapulted from where you were, when you first started Skedulo, but then going into post-COVID and really seeing the meaning of all of that come to life. I feel like that would have been a big shift.
I think that there's these technology shifts that are really major and almost set chapters of technology in companies. I think the mobile device was one of them. Cloud computing was one of them. The desktop computer was one of them, and sort of making that affordable and accessible sort of many decades ago. I think AI is probably one of the really recent ones that sort of has now maybe allowed us to think about the next chapter of technology. And off the back of every one of those page turns and those chapter changes in the book, there's so many companies that kind of get sparked by that transition. And I think we're seeing that in real time play out right now. But mobility was certainly one of those, and we were very, very fortunate, I think, to start Skedulo right as that was occurring. I will say, though, for as much as we talk about the application of generative AI and what we're going to do about it here at Skedulo, and I think so much talk in technology as an industry, when you actually work with real companies doing real things, most of the time, they're still catching up from like many of the things that we were talking about 10 years ago when we started Scheduler. Whether a bring your own device policy is appropriate, and the issues and challenges with tracking people as they move, and the sort of implications of doing work from a mobile device. And I'm sure we'll sort of see a similar adoption curve and kind of reality curve for AI and how it's applied in businesses. So super interesting.
Especially with the type of customers that you have that are like nurses that are out in the field, or technicians, or that sort of thing as well. Like I can imagine that having a big impact.
Yeah, I think the reality for Skedulo and for us as a company is we're not selling to tech companies as our primary audience. Some of our customers are wonderful, and they have really impressive technology teams and really progressive CIOs and CTOs in those organizations, and those are always really engaging conversations to be a part of. But for the most part, many of our customers, and frankly, the significant majority of companies everywhere around the world, are focused on like real, very bricks and mortar, very people service, oriented types of challenges. And, that's their primary mission and goal, is to make sure that they're delivering on these value propositions, and whatever it is they're doing, nursing or, installing a solar panel or fixing something by the side of the road, and I think the adoption of technology runs right alongside that, or is secondary to them really focusing on their core mission.
I think that's one of the interesting things about comms, and something we talk about a lot, is like that balance between painting a vision, talking about kind of future state, but not going too far that you do alienate the existing customer base who have just adopted, their first product or something like that. So I do think that's one of the things, we talk about a lot in comms, is that balance. And sometimes you're trying to create the momentum in the market by painting that vision, but I do think you need to be grounded in who's actually buying, and what are they buying, and where are they at in their technology journey, which is probably a good transition. Matt, I'm interested in I want to talk about the kind of the value of communications and how you see that, but I'm interested in your sort of communications journey, I guess, as a company. Kind of what have you dipped your toe in terms of using communication services or people or agencies? And then kind of where are you today in terms of the value of communications to your business?
Yeah, I think, like Katie said as she was framing this out, most of my experience is definitely, and probably most of the thought that I've put into this topic is kind of how do you communicate really effectively as a leader and as a CEO within a company, and having your team and your sort of internal stakeholders largely the focus of so much of the communication I've done. I'm probably less experienced talking about sort of public communications, but we've certainly done it in the past, engaged with an agency and engaged with reporters or other external stakeholders, and tried to refine and improve the way that we think about external communications as well. And I'd say that's had like varied or maybe limited success in sort of creating this catalyst moment of virality, or something that sort of ultimately impacted the top line of the business. And that's, I don't think, something that will exist forever, but probably has just meant my focus has been more internal and on my first audience more than external. And I wouldn't say those experiences weren't without frustration. I think it's really hard to kind of come in greenfield as a consultant or as a firm, try and unpack the value proposition and the message that the CEO is trying to communicate, and then wrap that up into something that's both kind of tangible and interesting, but also is attractive to the press or whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. I recognize that that's hard to do, and probably frustrating on both sides at times.
I think it's also when you're a growing company and you have this momentum around, or this focus around speed. So when you're building a company, you want to scale, product quickly. You want to get your customer base set up quickly. And you probably have the same expectations in terms of results with your external agency if you're doing comms, or that kind of first comms hire. And a lot of the times speed is not possible when you're still gathering the pieces together, like getting your messaging together and figuring out what customers you can use in your storytelling, or what data is relevant as well. So I can see how that would be frustrating from a founder's perspective too, to not get those results straight away.
Yeah, I think so. And I would also say, like, most founders that I know have this kind of really negative perspective on like jargon and fluff. And so I think at least I do, and I know others have at times found it like incredibly frustrating when it feels like what they're trying to get out of an exercise like this is actually an improvement to clarity and an improvement or an angle maybe that you haven't thought of before that could be interesting to an audience. But if you kind of are just hit by this wall of jargon and fluff and stuff that feels super generic, that's easy to see through really quickly. And I think that can definitely frustrate those exercises pretty quickly. But it's like anything. I think that the relationships you form and who you choose to work with ultimately come back to these kind of points, right?
Yeah. And kind of with that relationship, like what has worked for you so far when you're kind of working with somebody that is helping you tell your story or putting all those pieces together?
I think the best ones are where you've built enough of a relationship to the point at which you can be fairly like unencumbered by the level of transparency that you can have and the trust that you have with someone you're working with, so that they can both listen but then actively be refining a message and a story, and like adding to the process, and trust and relationship being a conduit to allowing that to happen successfully. I think trying to develop something that's so personal and so close to ultimately the message of a CEO or whatever it is, a leader anywhere, I think it is a fairly like intimidating and personal activity to go through. It's very exposing, and you've got to be comfortable enough to recognize where you suck and where what your strengths are from a messaging perspective, and be prepared to kind of trust someone to help you refine those over time. That's not an easy thing to do for everyone, I don't think, but so critical. Whether you're doing external or internal comms, it's super important.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's funny I think often CEOs and founders are very comfortable trusting someone who's in an area that's really not their area, right? Like they're not going to try and be a lawyer and try and do the contracts, right? You're going to get someone to help you to do that. But when it comes to comms, I think a lot of CEOs and founders are like, oh, I know how to do that. I should be able to do that. And it's not until you maybe come across a bigger comms issue, or maybe it's a catalyst moment in the company, or there's something where you hit that point where you go, actually, I don't know if I can, I need some help with this. Do you have one of those? Or what was your kind of moment where you went, particularly on the internal and the employee piece, where you thought, I could really use some help here on this piece?
Yeah, I think sometimes you got to go through existential moments of crisis, and I think going through painful things teaches you way more than just simply sort of succeeding on so many fronts, and also trying to learn a lot about yourself and what does and doesn't work along the way. And for me, I think we've just been through enough of those like existential moments, either internally or as a company or in the market or whatever, and I think this is important for any CEO and leader to do. You've got to just recognize that the way that you communicate and the level of intensity that you apply to how serious communication needs to be, particularly internally, in my opinion, it's just so important. And I think we've had a lot of leaders at Skedulo. I've seen many leaders elsewhere as well that maybe don't give it the same gravity and the same level of intensity I think you need to. And this has gotten worse, I think, over time as the pandemic and sort of other movements in our industry has put many of us into environments where communication is even harder. It's more asynchronous than it's ever been. It relies on like written communication, even if it's like somewhat synchronous, like Slack or something like that, where the turnaround's a lot faster. I think if you don't recognize that taking communications really seriously and refining it as part of your craft and your art as a leader and a CEO, then I think you're either like really, really good at it, and you can be self-taught, or you're going to hit these kind of walls and glass ceilings of your ability to lead. And when you think about the journey of any leader, so much of your journey, particularly as a founder and CEO, you're doing like so much on day one, and almost just as much on day 100 and day 1000. But there comes a point where you start to deliberately like chop things off and eliminate responsibilities that you had, fully appreciating that those are muscles that you're like deliberately letting disintegrate or develop atrophy. And those are like really deliberate decisions. but you end up like eliminating so much that you only have a few things that you really focus on at the end. And if communication isn't one of them, then I think you're in trouble because ultimately your job that's just continuous as a leader is figuring out how do you communicate effectively? How do you deliver a message and a vision super effectively? And whether that's internal or external, it sort of is one of the constant things you have to just keep getting better at and have to take really seriously as a CEO.
Yeah, I also think scale makes a difference as well. So, and I don't know if you experience this at Skedulo, but when you maybe have a couple of employees, it's sort of a little bit easier to be clear on what you need and have that level of communication. But as that scales out, as you have different locations, remote people, I do think that starts to become more important is how is this message being received by different people in different places and in different ways.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, talking about sort of existential moments at Skedulo, I think one of them that really relates to this topic was as a result of growing and scaling, realizing that the culture wasn't carrying forward. And I've said this other times in interviews, but I think that as a founder and CEO, like the culture of a company, as much as you might try and engineer it otherwise, it is just simply like this reflection of your personality or a few key personalities in leadership in the very early days. And that is pretty scalable when you're in that moment because like it's literally just you and the things that you value and the things that you do and the way that you communicate, the words you speak, they're heard by sort of almost everybody in real time. And so it's not difficult to create a culture. It's hard to create maybe the right culture and you have to be deliberate about who you are and how you're showing up. But the actual scaling of communication and culture is not incredibly difficult. But there reaches this point, maybe sort of 100 to 150 people that you're trying to communicate with, where certainly for us, I realized, man, why is there all this inertia and friction all of a sudden in the way that we think about culture and the way that we talk about our values and having them kind of anchor the decisions that we make. And you realize, man, not only am I just unable to talk to everybody and have my personality largely sort of intersect with the culture of the company, I don't even know everybody's name or them personally anymore. And if that's also true on the inverse and they don't know me personally, then how can I expect anything other than, friction and inertia here? And that's, we just had to make really deliberate decisions then about how we rebuilt and communicated our culture as a company. So I think that's one example where in those moments you realize just how important the clarity of your communication and alignment of that communication is in the life cycle of a growing company.
In the same vein as culture, at Skedulo, and this is something that, we've worked on for over a year now, but looking at your all hands calls and the level of transparency that you have in them and how you lead them as a co-founder and CEO is I was always been really impressed by. Like you share board member insights, you talk about metrics on the call. Just the level of detail that you go into is pretty incredible. And I think gives your employees such a opportunity to really understand the business and dig in. Why do you feel like that level of transparency is so important? Like, why is it structured in your head that way? What are you trying to help your employees with there? And what would you recommend to other founders that might struggle with creating that same level of transparency in their all hands calls?
I think there's a few reasons for that at Skedulo. One is just, again, probably just a natural extension of the way that I like to communicate. I think within reason and within sort of boundaries that are appropriate, transparency is often better than, opacity. And so I think that maybe has just come out sort of naturally. I think there's maybe sort of other things that are a bit more deliberate. One of which is, I think as your company gets bigger and you're talking and communicating to new people, the company goes through evolutions. And so as people leave and new people come in as well, like one of the single most important things I think for decision making and impact from any team member in the company anywhere is context. And I think transparency in those calls and those moments and the platform that is an all hands is the opportunity to try and impart as much context as possible in an environment that actually also allows tone and humor and empathy. So it's, you could probably deliver the same amount, if not more context, writing it all down, right? Let's say we just didn't have all hands, and we just wrote down all the content and brought everybody up to speed and everyone could look at a dashboard for metrics, for example. I think what that loses is the ability to combine these like hard, sometimes confronting, sometimes concerning aspects of building a company together with tone and humor and empathy and all of these other things that kind of actually makes communication so valuable and human. And that I think we sort of try and think about quite deliberately, because it's not always fun. It's not always, in fact, most of the time you're talking about hard things and scary things. And so, I think being really deliberate about how you communicate that and establishing platforms like an all hands is, I think, really important. Maybe the third reason I want to make sure it's inclusive as a process and other people can participate in it is that you don't get that many platforms to create where everybody is listening and everybody's dialed in and they're paying attention, or hopefully. I'm sure sometimes some of them aren't, but I think what that represented to me earlier on, and I want to make available to other leaders in the company as well, is this platform and environment to practice communicating. I think I've grown and improved as a communicator simply by just having a monthly all hands for the last probably 7 years that we've done it, and I think that's a really great, safe environment and platform for others to get that leverage in their own sort of development as well.
And even with the anonymous Q&As that you do, I think sometimes there's hard questions, but it also gives you this pulse check on how the company is doing and how they're feeling based on the types of questions that you get in. Like there was a question around, why does Skedulo have a K instead of an CH, and to have that question come in as like a priority question is really fun, but it also it shows that the serious questions are at the top of mind. Like people feel taken care of, everything is clear. So I don't know. That's how I took it. I don't know if you took it that way, but
I think it's nice that you start to observe like a mix of feelings. Some of those questions can be really difficult, and others can be like written in a way that I think is maybe not super appropriate, and so you try and reword them so that people will get value from not just the answer, but also how the question is communicated to a team.
Yeah.
And then other times it's like more lighthearted and just sort of interesting anecdotal stuff. And I think at the end of the day, that also is, a really important point when you think about communicating as a leader, certainly as a CEO, but in formats like an all hands as well. Tone and empathy and all these other things that I've spoken about are part of the value set, but so is storytelling. And I think those are good reminders of how valuable stories are to people in a team. Getting context is so important, but if you can do that within sort of this meta context of a story that you can tell, it's so much more interesting than just an answer to a pretty sort of banal question. But secondly, I think just far more memorable. Like people remember stories and they remember these kind of story-driven answers and narratives more than they do facts and, a number that was on a dashboard on a slide.
Yeah, it's something they can then take, and it's their story to then retell. And, I think I think storytelling's always been kind of a really powerful part of good communications. And it's funny, we were talking the other week about how do you define public relations and do we need an industry definition of communications? And so we're all clear. And I was kind of like, maybe, but I also just see us as like storytellers, and we've got to go find those stories and help companies tell them. So yeah, it's interesting you say that. I'm interested. Why does Skedulo have a K? I want to know the answer to that. If it's shareable on the
all hands, Katie.
Yeah, I'll come to the next one if you'll have me, and I'll anonymously ask it again.
I even had that thought. I was like, I just shared an all hands question on the podcast. Just let me know if you want to take that.
Yeah, I just thought that was funny that someone
the least
dove in
controversial
with
question.
the all hands.
Yeah. Did I just breach my NDA?
I have a question for both of you, because I guess it's, you're working together, but I'm interested in like, what are the things that work really well in terms of having an external consultant? Because obviously Boyson's not part of the business, but I know you are very open with her about giving her access to the business and kind of to make that successful. But I'm just interested in what works really well and maybe why a consultant or a freelancer, Matt, for you is the right solution.
That's a good question. I think that the kind of work that Katie and I do together is work that could equally, I think, be fulfilled by someone internally on the team. If there was someone sort of able and had the experience that Katie does, just as much as someone who's external. I think there's value to working with a contractor as well, in so much as the kind of experience and exposure they're getting to companies and leaders that aren't you. So much of this work is about refinement and coaching and hard feedback and maybe being able to sort of highlight and explain things that don't work or jokes that aren't funny or whatever. And having and kind of an external perspective and having the stakes so much lower than if you were an employee helps facilitate some of that feedback giving. But two, I think also helps just with the provision of like new ideas and different ways of thinking that kind of leaders are using to communicate. So that I will say, I think if Katie was on the team and we could work together full time, that would also be awesome. But I think right now this structure makes sense. I think at the end of the day, sort of coming back to what I was saying earlier, whoever you work with, whether they're an employee or whether they're external, just having a relationship that's built on trust will just accelerate all of the value that you're going to get from any sort of relationship and work together, because it is a pretty intimate task. It's and the feedback that you give is often pretty direct and can be confronting for people that maybe think about this differently. So I think regardless of the format, as long as you're building trust and a relationship that you can actually leverage, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, what really made it work was the relationship. Like Matt and I knew each other far before I started doing consulting. And so I think there was an element already of us kind of getting it together and like really getting each other and knowing how to riff and what works for Matt when he's trying to talk through a narrative and how I can capture that efficiently. I think the other thing which aligns to trust is the access to the team that Matt really gave me straight from the beginning. It not only gave me the feeling that I was empowered and that I could just proactively reach out to people across the business and across the leadership team and get what I needed to be able to support whatever I was working on. And so that was a big piece of it as well. Without that, and I mean, that's with any agency, if you're an in-house person, you need that access and you need to be trusted to just run and get what you need done. So I think from a consultant standpoint, it's having a bit of that entrepreneurial kind of drive to know when to start things up, when to ask the right questions, and when to reach out to the team outside of who your main contact is, whether that's in marketing or the founder or the CEO or whatever, and being able to navigate through that. And I feel very empowered to do that. And I think that's why it works.
Yeah, I think they're really good lessons, because I think you're right. It's like whether it's an independent consultant or an agency or even in-house, quite frankly, I think it won't work if that comms person doesn't have that ability to be part of those leadership discussions, have access to other leaders, all of that stuff. So I think they're really, that trust lesson and the relationship, but also that access, I think is really important, because you can't really understand a business, I think, if you're working with one individual without having kind of that bigger picture.
Now, Matt, I know that you split your time between Brisbane and San Francisco. How do you find the two markets from a communications perspective and maybe from an internal perspective, and how that complicates things with employees or bringing messages to customers? Do you notice a difference at all? Curious to hear your thought on that.
Yeah, I think actually one of the most consistent is customers. I think they're probably the most consistent between working whether here in Australia or the United States or broader North America or Europe. I think when your message and your value proposition is really clear, those conversations become quite consistent. You're trying to align you and your company to value and the problems they have. So that's probably not quite as interesting as maybe the difference between both internal and other kind of external stakeholder communication. I think that both are different if you just kind of try and generalize very broadly, and both have like positives and negatives in terms of how easy maybe communication is and how layered it needs to be. I think one of the nice things about being home in Australia and communicating both with the team and with others is I don't feel as much need, like there's not as much performative need that you can be yourself and quite relaxed and, communicate pretty directly. And Australians kind of call you on bullshit as well. So there's just not a lot of room to move in terms of, very colorful communication. Or exaggeration, which I think isn't necessarily the inverse in the US, but I think maybe folks here, and particularly I think in San Francisco, they just are used to and appreciate a different level of performance and enthusiasm and professionalism, maybe professional directness in the way that you communicate. And I think they're looking for different things when you speak and when you communicate as well. I think Australians are almost like looking for vulnerabilities and opportunities to bring you back down to earth. One of a better example. And that's okay. I think that's something you've just got to be comfortable with and recognize is part of your own character if you're also Australian. Whereas I think here it's maybe a little bit more positively intended, and they're looking for polish and momentum and sort of enthusiasm from your communication that as an Australian is sometimes hard to get to and achieve. It was certainly difficult for me. There are other Australian founders that I know who just mastered this craft and mastered this art, and they did it really early on, and they're very, very good at it. I found it maybe a bit more challenging when I moved to the US and started sort of figuring out how to do that, but particularly internally, I would say. But with investors and things like that, it's similar.
What were some of the ways that you kind of overcame that or worked on what that communication style looks like?
I think maybe two big things. One is I think just you have to kind of be a student of what's happening around you and the context within which you exist. And so rather than trying to resist it, I think if you just reach the point where you're like, okay, there is a difference here in the way that I need to communicate. There's a difference in the way that I need to show up, and maybe restructure some of the content of my communication in a way that's going to be easier for this audience to engage with it and connect with it. Like I found for myself, the sooner I did that, the more I could just focus on those specific things and improve and kind of test and improve. Like humor is a really good example of that, where I think naturally my humor is probably very self-deprecating, mostly sarcastic, obviously hilarious, but all of those things don't necessarily translate perfectly to the United States and the way that they communicate. And in fact, you can come off almost like offensive in some cases, particularly with sarcasm.
Yeah.
And so the sooner that you just embrace that reality and figure out, okay, I've got to make some turns here, the better. I think the other thing that's really important for any leader, and particularly CEOs, is you kind of at some point you have to accept and embrace the fact that you are performing a lot of the time that you're communicating. And it doesn't mean being disingenuous or inauthentic, but you are performing in the way that you speak, in the cadence that you use. Like these are practiced and improvable things that you have to learn, like any performer. But I think like any other good performer that's being themselves while they're performing, you're really just trying to exaggerate yourself and exaggerate your personality and the way that you communicate with others so that it's easier and faster and clearer for an audience to consume. And I think when the sooner that you kind of accept both of those things and become a student of them, the better you will be as a communicator over time, regardless of where you are in the US or Australia or anywhere.
Did you ever do like Toastmasters or anything like that?
No, I didn't. No, I think Skedulo all hands for the last 7 years. That was my Toastmasters. And I'm genuine when I say that. I remember the first few years I would be extremely nervous putting myself in front of everybody and delivering an all hands to the company, like super anxious and sort of jittery in my voice and a lot of anxiety. But over time and through practice, you become more comfortable. And it helps with any then communication that you're doing externally as well.
Yeah, I feel you on that. And it's so funny because a lot of the people that we ask to come onto the show that are actual comms people, their first response is, "Oh, I'm like not in front of the camera for a reason," and get really nervous about it. And I find it so funny because That was Devasy and I's first reaction when we started the podcast. We were just like, I'm sweaty all the time, and this is really scary to like actually say things and have them recorded. And it gives you this level of empathy for your poor executive that you're putting in front of a camera all the time and have for the past 20 years and being like, go do your job, you know? So I feel
Yep.
you on that now. I have a whole new level of respect. It's funny. Also, sorry, another side note. Scotty, when we moved back to the US, he really struggled in like bar settings and like when we're out to dinner and chatting with people because everybody thought he was such an asshole because of the like Australian humor. And he was just like, I just don't think I can go out. People just don't understand me here. And I was like, well, that's not the solution.
Yeah, it's them that are wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he's a Scorpio, so what are you going to do? He can't fix it.
Just have to keep him at home, Katie. There's nothing you can do.
Just lock him up. He stays in the basement now. Well, Matt, thank you so much. We want to end on this and see if you have a dumb and private moment to share. And we put all of our guests on the spot with this. I have one too. So we can.
Don't worry. Yeah, we'd love to know if you do have one.
I have many. I was trying to think about what's appropriate and what's not. But maybe the best, or maybe the one story that I have is, and this is really dumb, but I just moved into a new apartment, and it was like the first, when you move somewhere new, and the first night, it's almost like camping in your new, because you have like nothing set up. And I remember having furniture and appliances in this apartment, but that was basically it. I think like really nothing else. But I had this really new set of knives that I'd bought, and so they were
Where's this going?
great knife. Yeah, maybe this is a bit too gory. And I can't remember what I was making, but I ran down to the shop and bought a few things and then brought it back to the apartment to make dinner. It was like really late at night because I was unpacking boxes, whatever. And I remember starting to like chop this onion or something to make this dinner and thinking to myself, oh man, these knives are really sharp and I better be careful, like better not cut through my finger. And it was almost like the thought of thinking that actively put my thumb in the way of the knife, and I just sliced straight through my thumb. And but the other thing was that because I had nothing in this house. I had no first aid stuff. I had no band-aids, and I'm like running around looking for something just to like address this wound. In the end, I just had to rip my t-shirt off and rip it into like bandages and wrap it around my thumb and wrap it up with packing tape. And so that was, then I just went to bed and I figured it out in the morning.
I was going to say, did you go out to the club after like that?
No, that was it. I think I had I probably drank some whiskey or whatever for the pain, and that probably wasn't a good idea either, because I think that's blood thinning, not helpful in that moment. But anyway, that was pretty dumb. Because I remember very distinctly thinking that would be bad, and then it literally happened. So.
It reminds me of when you're skiing and you're like, don't look at the tree, don't hit that tree. Yeah. And because you're looking at it not to hit it, you keep going towards
That's exactly where you go.
Yeah. Well, that was cringe-inducing. It gave me a bit of a chill down my spine.
Why? You had me ripping my t-shirt and then wrapping it with packing tape. Like that.
I know. Desperate time.
Level.
Desperate time.
My dumb and private this week is just a pretty basic dumb and private that every single person I think can relate to. I'm flying to Austin, Texas for a conference tomorrow, and to save $50, I'm now flying out at 5:15 a.m. And I'm like, why did I do that 6 months ago when I booked this flight? Now I have a 5:15 a.m. flight. So that's my dumb and private. Hopefully everyone has done that before, so I feel a bit
Yeah,
I feel like I feel like that was how my parents raised me as well. It was like, if you can save, like you should do it. And then older me is like, I don't need to do that. Like I'm okay. I can
I feel like the other thing that happens there though is that there's a sweet spot between the time that you wanted to fly out and the one that you chose, like this exaggerated, like ridiculous time.
Yeah.
That is actually the best time to travel, because everybody is making that dumb decision. They're like, oh, I'm not going to leave at 8, I'm going to leave at 5:30. And then everybody's on the 5:30 flight and you like, it's just as busy
You know what I hate about this 5:30 flight too is because in Bend there's a lot of people, like I see Salesforce jackets everywhere. Like there's a huge tech community out here, and so like people are flying in for like a day in the office, like to San Francisco all the time, and so I just know I'm like gonna have a full plane tomorrow morning because people are doing the day trip.
Well,
Just
enjoy that,
Have
Boyson.
fun.
thanks.
I'm going to save mine because I feel like we've had two corkers today. So, Boyson, I'm going to save mine for our next one.
I love how you save it like you don't have a lot and you need to hold on to one.
I know,
so that
but I don't, but I will save it. I will save it. It's a good one. So I'm gonna hoard it and use it for the next pod.
all right. Well, Matt, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. I think this will be a really helpful chat for anyone that's looking into internal comms, or if you're a founder and you're thinking about what your comms kind of next steps need to look like. So really appreciate it. And I know you're busy, so thank you for making time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks. You're both legends. So happy to chat anytime. It was fun.
Yeah, thank
Thanks,
you.
Matt.
And for anybody that has a topic that they want to write in about, or they have a guest they want to have on the show, or anything else, tell us that we suck, anything like that. You can email us at hello@smartandpublicpod.com. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at smartandpublicpod, and listen to anywhere you get your podcasts. Please take the time. Please, please. It's very helpful for us to listen, rate, review, and subscribe. All right. See you next time. Okay. Bye.
Bye.